Good morning, everyone. My name is Sally Hopley. I'm the Sustainability Coordinator at MCC, and today we're hosting a presentation on leading regenerative organizations. So thank you all for joining us today. And just if you haven't joined us for an event as part of the SLPS before, the Sustainability Leadership Presentation Series, it's a partnership of organizations throughout Nebraska, and each organization that's a part of this membership, we host a sustainability presentation once a month during the academic year. So this year, our partners include Central Community College, Creighton University, the University of Nebraska at Omaha, Hastings College, ourselves, the Nebraska Recycling Council, and the Joslin Institute for Sustainable Communities. So this is our presentation for December. Our next presentation is scheduled for February 2021. So keep an eye on our social media and our websites for what that next presentation will be. We try and get those updated about 2 to 3 weeks ahead of time at least. Sounds good. So this morning, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kathleen Allen. She is going to be doing a presentation for us today on leading regenerative organizations. And I just want to give you a heads up on the format. So this is a more interactive presentation. So we'll be talking about some concepts and then as a group be discussing a little bit, do a little bit of reflection and then going back to a presentation. So just kind of a heads up on that. But Dr. Kathleen Allen is president of her consulting firm, Kathleen Allen and Associates. She has led organizations for over 25 years and consulted with organizations and leaders for the past 20 years. In her consulting practice, she specializes in leadership coaching and organizational change in human service and nonprofit organizations, foundations, small to mid-sized businesses, healthcare, higher educational institutions, and collaborative networks. Dr. Allen has written and presented widely on topics related to leadership, human development, and organizational development. She's a skilled facilitator of organizational change and organizational development. The earmarks of her work are the creation of shared ownership and the results of a change project, long-term sustainable change for the organization, and increased capacity for staff members and leaders in those organizations. She is the author of Leading from the Roots, Nature-Inspired Leadership Lessons for Today's World. She has also co-authored Systemic Leadership, Enriching the Meaning of Our Work, and has written many articles and contributed to a variety of books, including the Transforming the Leader, New Approaches to Leadership for the 21st Century, and Innovation in Environmental Leadership, Critical Perspectives. She has a doctorate in leadership from the University of San Diego, California. So with that, thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to go ahead and we'll do a presentation switch to Dr. Allen.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being here and being a part of this. I'm looking forward to our conversation. I'm looking to talk a little bit about regenerative systems and the intersection of designing regenerative systems, lessons from nature, what we can apply to leadership, and also how we can apply it to all of our work in sustainability. So why do I use the language of regenerative? I think that regenerative systems are, whether it's an organization, a community, an ecosystem, but when they are designed to regenerate, they have increased vitality and increased resilience. And they are designed to support the life of future generations. So basically, it's a perfect kind of intersection between sustainability and regenerative. They optimize, regenerative systems always optimize the whole system over individual parts of the system. If you think about some of our language about how we look at issues today, sometimes we say, well, you know, climate change is the issue, as if it's rank ordered at the very top of our day. And yet, if we are looking at the whole system, we would be looking not just at climate change and environment, but we'd also be looking at the care of people and planet. We'd have more of an intersectional kind of frame if we were looking at things from a whole system. The introduction of the triple bottom line is people, planet, and profit is kind of an attempt to try to begin to see our systems in a more integrated way. I love this quote from Gregory Bateson. It's from a film called The Ecology of Mind that was released in 2011. And this is a conversation that he is having with one of his daughters. And he asked the question, what is it about our way of perceiving that makes us not see the delicate interdependencies in an ecological system that give it its integrity? And then his daughter comes into that conversation and says, we don't see them, and therefore we break them. And this is really what's happening in our world today, as we're moving out of, we have been breaking these kind of delicate interdependencies regularly, and we're kind of living in a world where it's degenerating rather than regenerating. So if you decide that regenerative is one of the places that you want to go as a leader, as a person leading a team, an organization, in community work, in systems change work, then your purpose in your leadership, again, is trying to support the whole. This was something that I wrote with a group of 5 women back in 1998, where we were beginning to play with the idea of how do we, what really should the purpose of leadership be? And we kind of came up with these to create a supportive environment where people can thrive and grow, live in peace with one another, to promote harmony with nature, and thereby sustainability for future generations, and create communities of reciprocal care and shared responsibility, where every person matters and each person's welfare and dignity is respected and supported. So my question is, if the whole mattered, what would our purpose be? This is an approximation of what we were thinking of back in 1998, of how do we really reframe leadership, and its leadership for what, towards what end should we be leading? So where do we learn about regenerative systems? To me, it's a fairly obvious choice to that if we could learn to lead and design our organizations and our systems with a regenerative frame, that we would all do better. Our environment would do better, all the species in the environment would do better, people would do better, and there would be lots of sustained benefits. But where do we learn how to do this? So my research around leadership and nature is looking at really how do we use nature as a mentor, a model, a muse to help us rethink how we design things. So why nature? Nature is the longest running regenerative system that we have to learn from. So nature is 3.8 billion years on this planet. And this, and it's been experimenting. It's like this major R&D lab that we can learn a lot from. We've survived 5 mass extinctions in the on this planet alone, and yet nature is designed to regenerate. And that those designs are one of the things that we're going to look at in a little more detail. If nature were said to have a purpose, it would be to create conditions conducive to the life of future generations. So that's really what orients all of its design. And it uses feedback to curb excesses and reinforce purpose. And it's a living system. It's dynamic, it's evolving, it's interdependent, it's complex. And so it's just like the organizations and the communities and that we're living in now. So to kind of give you a sense of the elegance of nature and its design, I want to share this video on how wolves changed rivers in Yellowstone National Park.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds, of migratory birds, started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes. And as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
So this is really the power of nature's design. It helps us understand the elegance, the complexity, and the simplicity on the other side of complexity of how nature designs itself to regenerate. The reason why the wolves were able to have that outsized impact on the ecological system in Yellowstone is that they are a keystone species. And as a keystone species, they shape behavior within an ecosystem, just like beavers do within a water system or sharks do in an ocean system. And these keystone species can have this kind of impact because nature is designed to fundamentally be interdependent, to be a living interdependent system. And these are, I'm just going to kind of go through these nature designs. And while I talk about them, what I'd like you to do, we're going to do a short breakout group after this, just to give you an opportunity to have conversations with each other among what are some of these design lessons that seem to resonate with you and the work that you do. So I'm just going to kind of go through them and remember that as a group, all of these design lessons basically work together in an interdependent way to create this kind of regenerative outcome in the larger system. Because even though we have climate change, and some people would say we might be starting the sixth mass extinction, the thing is that people often frame nature as a victim of humankind. And while, yes, our actions are creating a negative impact, nature will regenerate itself. But human beings may not be around to see it. So we'll see what happens. Stay tuned, so to speak. But the first nature design principle is that it runs on sunlight. Nature is stunningly generous. Think about sunlight as the first generous act in nature. It is a free resource, an energy resource that then, when combined with photosynthesis, it fuels all nutrients that we live by on this planet. So it runs on nature. But what's also interesting is the second generous act that nature is embedded in the design is it requires active participation in order for that generosity to be unleashed. So without photosynthesis, sunlight falls on the moon, but nothing grows on the moon. But when you have grass and leaves and algae, the sunlight, this free resource, turns into, with collaboration and active engagement of photosynthesis, turns into nutrients that fuel all life on this planet. So that's the first framework of nature, is it runs on sunlight. Organizationally, my questions that flow from this are, what is our organizational version of sunlight? Do we have a free resource that we can't see or don't see right now because we don't think in that way? And what is the organizational photosynthesis, or possibly the photosynthesis involved in leadership, that unleashes this energy in a way that we can then use it in our organizations? My thinking is that human energy, positive human energy, is a huge, powerful asset that can be unleashed in our organizations if we have the right organizational photosynthesis. Waste is never wasted. In a legacy tree in an ecological system, it gives back 5 times the length of its lifetime after it dies to the ecological system. So if you have a legacy tree that has lived for 1,000 years, it's still contributing back to that system through releasing of additional nutrients as it decays 5,000 years later. Think about that for a moment. And yet we have designed things to fill landfill and create products that don't come back and recontribute. And another way of saying this is that waste is some other species' food in an ecological system. But but we don't think about this. And in our organizations, we waste things all the time. We waste talent, we waste money, we waste time, we waste our energy. The next one is that form always fits function. The form that nature takes is always aligned with the larger purpose that the form is there to serve. Now, in human organizations, we kind of fall in love with our forms, even when they no longer serve our larger purpose of what we're designed to do. And so we become kind of rigid and inflexible, and we don't adapt to changing conditions. But in nature, the form always shifts. So if you can kind of imagine in your head, following a river from a snow belt up on a mountain, coming down the mountainside in small waterfalls or large waterfalls, or little ripples or backwaters or eddies, and it just keeps being pulled by gravity. And water changes its form as it gets pulled to the gravity of any kind of landscape. So I always think about organizations. How can we flow in from one form to another, just like water does, from a waterfall to a rapids to a slow meandering stream? The next piece is that nature rewards cooperation. So as nature, we often have this kind of image that comes out of Darwin's research, that nature is all about survival of the fittest. But actually, Darwin's research said that it's actually survival of the best fit. So instead of the strongest species in a system, the species that is better at adapting is the species that will allow their DNA to be passed on to future generations. That's a perfect example of form fits function. So then in nature, what happens is that it is designed to reward cooperation, not self-interest. For example, mycelium is a fungi that runs underground across underneath the forest floor, and that the mycelium share information, they share nutrients, and they share communication between one tree and another on the forest floor. This is a cooperation. We know that there are hawks and wolves and foxes that hunt together in a cooperative way to expand the base of what they can hunt and eat. As ecological systems become more sophisticated and evolve from a stage 1 to a stage 3 ecosystem, a stage 3 ecosystem has lots of diversity, and in that diversity, there becomes a kind of a cooperative relationship, a mutualistic relationship between species and plants, where a nutrient that one species needs is provided by another species' resources and abundance, and vice versa. And this is really how nature is designed, in this cooperative way. The next one is that nature banks on diversity. So I'm speaking to many people from Nebraska, and I'm sure that you have great visuals in your experience of mature prairies and how they are designed. And one of the things that we know about prairies is that prairies capture almost all of the resources that are dropped on them. So if we have a deluge of rain, a prairie is structured to have a surface root structure, a deeper mid root structure, and a very deep root structure, all embedded in the variety of plants that are embedded in a prairie. So when you have a huge 3 or 4 inch or 5 inch rain, the surface roots get saturated, and then the next roots down start drawing those down, and then as it continues to rain, it draws down even more. So you don't have runoff in a prairie. Another beautiful thing about diversity is that it makes pests, it makes a prairie less vulnerable to pests. So if you have locusts that are looking for a cornfield and you have a monocrop, what happens is that they just see it as a big buffet. But the pests and the plants that they like to eat have a chemical signature, kind of like a lock and key. One is seeking a certain kind of thing, and once they lock in, then they go in. But in a prairie, because of the diversity of it, the way it's structured, it creates more difficulty finding its food. And so it doesn't become as vulnerable. So what happens in nature is that the more diverse we become, the more resilient our systems become, the more the greater ability they have to thrive and regenerate. Think of this as a single food chain versus a food web. If you have a single food chain and you wipe out one of the elements of the food chain, everything above that food chain dies. But in a food web, there are lots of different ways to get resources flowing through the system. The next design principle, again, what I want you to be thinking is thinking how these ideas might show up in a playful kind of conversation in your work, or could be utilized to help you shape your work and your leadership. So the next one is that nature depends on local expertise and self-organization. Everything is contextually driven in nature, whether it's an ecosystem or a micro ecosystem. And self-organization is another core principle of nature. So nature does not have a CEO. We don't have somebody standing over the system telling the system how to behave. The system knows its place, its context. It knows what works in that place, and it unleashes self-organization. I often ask the question, what do ants and bees and humans have in common? And the thing they have in common is that they all self-organize. And how are we different from ants and bees? Ants and bees self-organize all the time, but humans tend to selectively self-organize. We are designed and part of nature, so we have this ability to initiate and organize our own work, our own play, our own life, but we selectively use it. And if we could, in our organizations, unleash and design our organizations to unleash self-organization, we would have so many more capacity and productivity that could show up in our workspaces. The next one is that nature curbs excesses from within. Basically, it uses information and feedback to help the system evolve. And when you have an excess in nature, there is always a feedback loop. It could be a slow feedback loop that might take a year or 10 years, or it could be a very fast feedback loop that shuts down the behavior, the excess of behavior that doesn't serve the larger system. In organizations, one of the ways I see feedback and information curbing excess is that when I go into organizations, there are always, even in healthy pockets, healthy organizations, there are pockets of dysfunction or where teams or maybe supervisors aren't really serving the organization at its highest level. And one of the things I've noticed around feedback is that if dysfunction almost always exists in an organization, a human organization, when that person doesn't want to hear feedback or shuts it down or becomes too busy to listen or is too defensive to listen. And so the idea of nurturing and enhancing and strengthening feedback within an organization or a project that you're doing is one of the ways that you stay on track with what you're trying to do in your highest purpose. The next piece is that nature always taps the power of limits. So I live in Minnesota. It's a zone 3 for those of you who are gardeners on the call. And that means that my favorite rhododendron plant that I grew up in Western Pennsylvania with is just not able to grow in my climate. Now, I could build a greenhouse. I could heat the greenhouse during the winter, spend a lot of money to try to grow in an artificial, semi-artificial environment the rhododendrons that I loved. Or I could acknowledge that the temperature and the moisture and the growing season and the soil conditions, that those limits should shape what I choose to grow in my garden. So in nature, we know that life thrives within limits. So there's always limits in an ecosystem or a micro ecosystem that nature acknowledges, and then it uses those limits to create life and allow life to thrive. I recently read an article that there are tens of thousands of species under the ice cap in Antarctica that thrive. And that's another example of tapping the power of limits. Now, organizationally, one of the things that we don't like to do very well is we don't like to tap the power of limits. We always think if our vision is bigger than our budget, we try to figure out how to bring more resources to bear. Nature would look at, if our vision is bigger than our budget, it would look at relationships and cooperation and diversity to build the resources to help you accomplish the vision without needing to spend more money. And then lastly, nature solutions disappear into a system. And the idea here is that if you lead with the assumption of interdependence, just like the wolves in Yellowstone, you can create kind of a trophic cascade in the organization that you're trying to influence. And when you do that, the solution doesn't rest on top of your to-do list, kind of like a lot of our strategic plans do. It embeds itself into the natural dynamics of the system around you. So that's how solutions disappear into the system when you lead from a nature's perspective and you acknowledge that all of our organizational systems are living systems, just like nature. Okay, so here's your first exercise. We're going to do some breakout rooms, and what I'd like you to do is to take one or two of those design principles in your small group and play with it. So there's this concept called, how do you envision something that you're not used to seeing? So over here to the left, this is a typical kind of playing field that we think of. We have all of these kind of lines that help us see where the soccer framework is, et cetera, et cetera. And we've always played within the lines. So many of us have grown up in organizations with lessons on what leadership looks like, what organizations look like, what HR systems look like, what our relationship to the supervisor is, et cetera, et cetera. And we play within those rules. But juxtapose that to this beautiful kind of wild, organic prairie and say, okay, what if I took these design principles and instead of playing on the field with the rules that I know, we would play in this other space. So one of the ways you start imagining something else is you go play on a different field. So how could you apply the design of organizations or sustainability projects or the practice of leadership or the concepts that you teach to others? How could you apply one or two of these principles? So what I'd like to do is give you 15 minutes to break into groups. I don't know whether we'll do 2 or 3. I'm assuming our facilitators will figure that out. And then have a conversation about play. Where did your mind go as I was sharing these design principles? Were there certain ideas that attracted your attention? And then share that in your group, have fun, play with it, and then be prepared to come back and play and share one of the ideas that popped up from the group. So I'm going to let you go and move into small groups and have that conversation. Shall we invite people back in with ideas? So this is a framework of, in self-organization, when you assume that self-organization is alive and well in humans, then the idea of teaching is always done from the front of the room. So the knowledge is held by the person presenting. But in self-organization, you actually say the wisdom is already in the room, the experiment and the experimenting is already in the room, and you're just trying to create a space for it to unleash. And so if we could, so when I come back and say, give us one idea that kind of surfaced for you in your conversation, or one insight, or maybe a description of what happened, we start to spread the learning that has already occurred in one breakout room to the others and vice versa. So it's a cooperative kind of exchange of resource and knowledge. And we know in living systems that living systems always evolve with information. So this is information that we're sharing. Think of it as DNA sharing via information of our conversations. So what do you find out in your conversations in your breakout rooms?
Come on, team one. I know we had some good conversations there, so I know someone can share.
Well, one of the things we talked about was the diversity aspect, and how it's important that we understand that everyone involved in an endeavor is an important piece of that endeavor. And we're all interconnected and interdependent in that way. And for that reason, maybe each of us should have a voice at the table.
You know, one of the beautiful things about nature and my study of it and its application to leadership and organizations is that it's changed some of the powerful questions that I ask. So on the diversity, how would nature approach diversity? Fundamentally, we know in its design that diversity is essential for systems to evolve and to become more resilient and more generous. And so I've often looked at diversity from the framework of, you know, what's the fear that's holding things back? How are we framing diversity? Do we think of bringing more diversity in the room as, you know, a good thing to do, or do we think of it as something that's essential? And in nature would say, not say what is the benefit of diversity, it would say what is the risk of homogeneity. So in all natural systems that don't have diversity, they're more fragile. All natural systems. So if we applied this to human systems, then it would say that every time we look around a room and we only see people that look like us, that we're creating and supporting a more fragile system rather than a more robust, resilient system. And so sometimes the question, just shifting the question, shifts the motivation and energy and the importance of why our work around diversity matters to our organizations.
I love that explanation.
That's superb.
That is right on. And I will be borrowing some of these.
Please, you know, I give free permission to borrow, steal, hitchhike off of, but it is really a powerful kind of shift in mind.
I don't know that we had any, you know, concrete findings, and, you know, my breakout room, please feel free to jump in as well. I think ours was pretty free flowing, but we like the ideas and, you know, the frame, using this framework to view our current systems and kind of how it can be kind of surprising as we look at our systems as, you know, oh, nature doesn't waste. Well, what does that look like? Or, you know, and also just, you know, nature is very complex, but so are human systems, and how the complexity of our systems can block some of these efforts as well. But how having these questions in this framework kind of gives us a new way to go, or new questions to ask.
That's kind of where my experimentation has gone. One of the things that kind of intersects diversity and structure was, I had one organization I was working with that they were really trying to help everybody in the organization to see themselves as being important and meaningful. And we realized that the organizational chart that looks like a pyramid made everybody at the bottom of the pyramid feel vulnerable and invisible. And all people in the middle kind of torn between the tops and the bottoms, and the people at the tops holding all the privilege and making all the rules. And so we changed the organizational chart to a tree, and we put the leadership really fundamentally in the roots of this tree, and the back office kind of structures like finance and HR and technology kind of in the root of the tree, because they're bringing the resources up. And then we put all of our frontline folks in the small branches and leaves. So all of those frontline people actually are fundamentally important, because they're translating sunlight into nutrients that feed the whole tree. And then our programmatic arms are kind of also in the branches of the tree. And so when our frontline people saw themselves in that way, not at the bottom of a pyramid with a whole bunch of people stacked on top of it, but literally as a living entity, as part of a living tree. And they began to see the importance of their contributions and the resources that they were bringing and why they were critical and essential, to borrow the 220 language, for the larger system to work. And so sometimes having even more nature-based visuals can help people see themselves in relationship to each other in a very different way. So I'm going to kind of go on forward to the next piece here, to really just kind of nail down the regenerativity and what is holding.
Aspen and
We
willow.
don't want to go down there. So
And as soon as that happened, the birds started, and
okay.
the number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are
Hang on,
ecosystem engineers. They
I'll
create
go back in
niches
for a minute.
other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians.
Okay,
the wolves killed
one more
coyotes,
time, sorry.
And as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers, ravens and
okay, sorry.
bald eagles.
So I've been playing with this frame called regenerative versus degenerative systems. So this is kind of the, there are two continuums, you know, one is an exploitive approach versus a sustainable approach. So this is kind of the horizontal continuum. And I've been playing with the question of what is holding our patterns, our behaviors in place. So in an exploitive approach, basically the reason why it's degenerative, it's more degenerative than sustainable and regenerative, is that it always takes more energy to hold an exploitive system in place. And I think that there are certain ways of thinking that also reinforce an exploitive approach. So basically with our resources, it's like a dig, burn, dump kind of exploitation of natural resources, but also human resources, so that we extract and then we exploit, and we don't share the benefits and burdens. So what's helping us hold this in place? One is the short-term thinking. So when we think in terms of quarters or annual budgets, we always create more of a resource drain, exploitive framework than a sustainable framework. When we see ourselves separate from the system, that Dan Arley has done he's an economist, I think out of MIT, he has done research on when a person or people feel separate from the system, it basically increases greed and self-interest as a manifestation of how they interact with that system. So when we see ourselves as separate from a system, it again moves us more into, it's easier to exploit others to do when we see ourselves as separate. And then this kind of framework of self-interest, you know, what are my rights? What are my freedom? How do I build wealth for myself, but I don't need to worry about what's going on with others. But the worldview, so as you move towards more sustainable design and regenerative design, what you're looking for is the simplest, least energy that you can use to get the highest, best purpose. That's another way of thinking about sustainability, is it's efficient and it's effective. And it doesn't waste money and energy. And this always the exploitive uses more energy in some way, shape, or form. So what are the worldviews that are holding the long-term in place? Well, one is the long-term thinking versus short-term. One is, instead of separation, you move towards seeing and using the interdependence, the delicate interdependencies of a system, and from self-interest to optimizing the whole. So I'm just going to tell one story about a shift from short-term to long-term. So one of my projects last year was to work with the Metropolitan Airport Commission in Minneapolis-St. Paul, and I worked with Daniel Lossie from Veritas, the Veritas Group in Omaha. And he and I were working with them to set their 2030 goals for sustainability. And one of the things I loved about working with the MAC, and we're starting up our work again next year, is that they had people on their leadership team who were asking the question, how can we design and lead an organization so it's still thriving 100 years from now? That's a long-term frame. But what I noticed was how much the long-term frame changed everything that they did. It changed the way they budgeted. So they looked at investments, not just expenditures, and they looked at saving for a rainy day. So when COVID hit, they didn't lay off anybody because they had a rainy day fund, because they were looking at how do we conserve our resources year to year so that when disruptions happen, we have resources to respond to that. That would be an example. They are making 50-year runways instead of 20-year runways to reduce waste, but also because but it costs more, so they're willing to invest. It also changed the way the leadership team thought of themselves. They thought that they were part of a leadership relay race. So they inherited the present from past leadership decisions and actions. They inherited the constraints and also the possibilities from those actions in the past. And then they want to hand off the baton, the leadership baton, to the next generation of leaders for that organization, so it's in the highest, best possible shape going forward. So that's just, and it's changed the way they innovate and adapt in that organization, because when you think of yourself as a living system trying to be thriving 100 years from now, you have to pay attention to what's changing in the external environment. So your adaptive innovation is very alive and well. So that's just an example of how when we shift from one to the next, all of a sudden, a lot of your cultural decisions are embedded in a sustainable approach rather than an exploitive approach. And then the vertical line is regenerative to a degenerative continuum. So what's holding our degenerative system in place? And when you think, so to exploit and extract requires control over. So there's always, and that requires a closed system. So if you keep your system tightly bounded, then you can make decisions that because of the interdependence of the system, have massive ripple effects through the larger global system, but you can act as if you don't care and it doesn't matter. So there's this strong kind of control over energy that happens in a degenerative system. And it tends to objectify the people in the system, more mechanistic and inert as opposed to living. So if you've ever worked in an organization where you have felt objectified, that you're experiencing something that is designed more on a degenerative framework as opposed to a regenerative. And then these closed systems, short-term separation, self-interest, mechanistic objectification, they tend to bring emotions of scarcity, fear, and I would probably add greed to this list. But regenerative, when you go up and you start learning from nature, you realize that anytime you're in a regenerative system, you actually have increased vitality and increased resilience, and I would say increased positive energy. So if any of you have ever worked with a great team that is just a joy to come in and work with every day, that would be, you would be experiencing some of the vitality and resilience of a regenerative system. And regenerative systems are open systems. Their whole orientation is how do we continue to adapt and evolve so we can thrive and aid the thrivability of future generations. It looks at the organization and the environment as a totally living system. It's made up of living entities, whether it's a plant or a person, a living system. Now we have, I just picked up this book from a Dutch author that is now thinking that there's a concept of healing organizations from trauma because organizations are living system. We can't fix it, a traumatic experience in a mechanistic way. That's what we would do over here. But in a living system, we have to figure out how to heal it and design our way out of it. And then there's a different set of emotions like trust, cooperation that emerges in this kind of regenerative place. So then when you put these two lines together, this is kind of how I see what we're about. So the exploitive approach, we're trying to move this way up towards a regenerative approach in the way we lead organizations, the way we think of systems, and the worldviews that are holding the degenerating system in place are closed system, short-term, separation, self-interest, mechanistic, scarcity, fear, all of those things are holding this. But when we move up above this line to something that's more regenerative, you get into this open system, long and short time horizons, really seeing the interdependence and connectivity of the system. You know, folks who are down here who are denying that we're connected, what's interesting is that it doesn't matter whether they're denying it or it. When you deny that we're not connected, when you deny connection, it doesn't mean connection doesn't exist. When you deny climate change, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's still existing, it's still going on. So when you deny, you're just accelerating the diminishment of the increase of fragility and the diminishment of resilience. And so how do you move to these kind of regenerative places? Now, on the right side, what you see is this kind of conventional practice and thinking. This is fundamentally the problem, is that much of our leadership theory, our management, our educational systems, our politics, societal norms, and all of that's encoded in the law are contributing to our current reality of living in a more and more degenerating system. One of the outcomes of COVID is it's helped us see the fragility of what's going on in our system, in our health system, in our education systems, in our political systems, and in our legal systems. But when we start engaging in sustainability work, sustainability I see as kind of a zero on a plus 100, minus 100 framework. So sustainable is do no harm to future generations, but it doesn't get us to this next place, which is maybe plus 30, plus 50 in this line, which is how do we learn to design for rapid recovery? So in COVID, we're dealing with a massive disruption. It's not an interruption, but it's a disruption. And when you have a disruption, a lot of the rules that are holding us down here can be put into flux because they're the inadequate kind of framing of how we frame social justice, for example. All of that has been kind of stripped from our eyes, and we now see it in totally different ways. But eventually, we are trying to aim towards this regenerative frame. So we design as nature designs. We lead with a living system mindset, and we optimize self-organization, and we hold it all together in a sense of purpose. You know, what is fundamentally the larger shared purpose of what we're trying to do? In nature, it's always about creating conditions conducive to the life of future generations. That's the frame. So this is kind of my thinking around regenerative. And it will require us to change. And I want to give you this this simple video on what how nature, how one species, the eagle, faces change in nature. So here's, we have some time for conversations and reflections. The reason why I showed the eagle video was that so much of our degenerating system is embedded in what we've been taught and what we think is normal. We think it's normal for people to put self-interest above the common interest. We think it's normal for us to see ourselves as separate from each other. We think it's normal to think in short term only. We think it's normal to maybe have a degenerative effect or contribute to that in an organization. We think it's normal to exploit and extract resources and people, but we don't have to go there. And one of the really interesting gifts this massive disruption of a pandemic has given to us is that it's given us a point of pause to try to imagine, who do we want to be on the other side of this? Just like the eagle, are we willing to have 150 metaphoric days of pain, of letting go, in order to get another 30 years of life to thrive? So what questions and observations are emerging for you from these ideas, and how might these ideas shape the way you think you might want to approach something going forward? And what big questions are you living with as a result of this conversation today?
One piece that I found helpful, and I like the eagle video because it hits the nail on the head, is that process takes time.
Mm-hmm.
And so knowing where people are at in that journey, like, because sometimes it gets, so I've been thinking about some of these nature-based concepts personally for 20 years. And so I've had a lot of time to process and deconstruct, like, how this is different than what I've done. But most people I work with may not have had any time thinking of it. This might be the first time they've heard it. And so figuring out how to have everyone progress forward, even though we're not at the same place, and not getting so frustrated with people that it like closes a door because they think they can never bridge that difference in worldview, even though, I'm like, well, I was there, I get it. And it's difficult and sometimes painfully slow, but how to make progress, not perfection, be the goal. Because some people are, and I'm thinking like within my family too on some of these issues. So I like that eagle video to illustrate that.
One of the things that I've found is that I'm starting to play around with, so in nature often uses the least amount of energy for the highest possible outcome. So I've been trying to figure out, in terms of massive global change, what are those simple, small things that we can do to create a massive kind of cascading effect? In other words, trigger a trophic cascade, in the way the re-entry of wolves after 70 years in Yellowstone used the interdependence and the natural kind of design of the system to bring this system into greater resilience and greater diversity. So those are, because I'm not sure that we have, I think we have to start thinking differently to think about how we influence change with the people we're working with. Because even the way we think about change has been affected by these kind of traditional theories and practices. I don't have a full answer for you, Crystal, but I am starting to play with that, and I have a few ideas.
I'm wondering if there are any particular hurdles when you are dealing with very, very large organizations as opposed to a small organization?
Well, large organizations like corporations that have been highly successful in a degenerative world are going to be much more resistant to change because they've succeeded. the problem is that when they fall, they're going to fall hard because they're not ongoing. There's no ongoing adaptation. There's this framework in nature called an adaptive cycle, which is, I find it a very powerful kind of frame. It's just a simple infinity loop on its side, and it is a continuous loop. So for 3.8 billion years, nature has been in this fluid line of adaptation. So it goes from explore at the top to launch and experiment to sustain to release, and then it goes back up to explore, launch, sustain, release, ongoing. So now when I go into organizations, I look at two thresholds on either side of that adaptive cycle. One is, where are people failing to invest in their future? Even though they know this is a good idea and this will help them continue to evolve as an organization, they get scared or they worry about resources and bring a scarcity framework. And so they fail to invest. So they stick with what they know and they don't invent the next. And the next one is at the threshold between sustain and release. And there I look in organizations where there's too much rigidity. The more rigid your system is, the more likely your business model is going to collapse underneath you. And that's when the rigidity comes from following form over function, over purpose. So look at where people have, kind of added procedural cement to things in your organization and created these highly rigid organizational structures. They're no longer adapting on their own. And so I've worked with organizations whose industries have fundamentally changed in the last year and watched them struggle to move out of this rigidity framework to releasing, just like the eagle releases to invent anew. So I think, Diane, my answer to you is that size matters in a sense of sometimes size holds the old degenerative framework more strongly if they've been successful and money's involved, or vast amounts of money has been involved. So but perhaps, but that doesn't change their need for change. And we've just loaded up, thank you, Sally, the handout on the 9 design principles with some description and some powerful questions you can ask, and you can take that home with you today. And if you want to use the PowerPoint or get access to it, you can email Sally, and we're happy to share that with you. Are there other questions that people are holding or would like to ask before we end today?
I'd just like to make a comment that based on what you've just said, I can see that your methodologies and your approach might be extremely useful, not just for organizations, but for neighborhoods and communities, and even systems of government, from very small to very large. And it's a way of thinking, it's a way of approaching being that that could benefit on every level.
Thank you, Diane. I've been working for the last 8 years with the Nebraska Community Foundation, helping build resilient rural communities across Nebraska through their community fund and leveraging philanthropy in these communities. And we have continually moved this whole network of communities and community funds that are connected to the Nebraska Community Foundation towards a living system framework, using nature's design, nature's way of thinking about leadership and change to leverage massive change in that system. And it's really been, so yes, it totally scales, Diane, to community work. Any other thoughts? Questions? I have one last little thing I'm going to share. So if you want more, you can always read it in my book. The handout gives you a little mini thing there. And then if you like these ideas and want to get a weekly kind of short insight, you can sign up for my blog on my website. But just as another kind of frame, I love this little reminder about the interdependence in nature. Nothing in nature lives for itself. Rivers don't drink their own water. Trees don't eat their own fruit. Sun doesn't shine for itself. A flower's fragrance is not for itself. And living for each other is nature's rule. I just love this as a kind of reminder of how deeply embedded interdependence is as part of nature's structure. So any other thoughts, questions, connections?
I think with that video of the eagle, the thing that still strikes me is it's amazing that they just know how to do that. And I don't know that humans have that built in, but it's such an amazing process that they go through that they just intuitively know.
Some people ask, what is different between humans and nature? And one of the things that is different is that humans have consciousness and emotions, and nature has instinct, and it operates very differently. So the eagle is operating on instinct when it makes a choice to live and reinvent itself. But we fall in love with certain ways of thinking. We have fear that interferes with our ability to sometimes take in feedback that tells us we need to change and evolve. So our consciousness becomes, and our ability to manage our emotions are really keys to helping us move in more of this kind of living system frame. Because you're right, the eagle has instinct, but we have a powerful mind. We can deny reality. We have all kinds of ways we diminish what is actually happening around us. Yeah. Anything else? We're ending at 1, right? On the dot, or?
Yeah.
So
no, I thank you everyone for joining us today. I put some things in the chat. If you would like a copy of the presentation or the handout, feel free to contact me. My email is in the chat. It's sdhopley@mccneb.edu. And we will also have a copy of this presentation on the SLPS YouTube channel as well. So if you want to come back and remember what we talked about, we'll have it recorded on there too. But thank you all for joining us today.
thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks.
Okay.